Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Hodges. I'm President and Chief Executive Officer of McGuire Woods Consulting. We are pleased to, as we do every 2 years, provide a pre-election overview of the critical elections around the country. I have a number of colleagues here today to remind you, we have offices in Washington, D.C. and state capitals in the Southeast, also in Illinois, Texas, and California. Our group does federal and state government relations and a wide variety of other matters that are related to government. We always enjoy doing this for our friends and clients, talking about what's coming in the upcoming elections. And I think you'll find our team today will provide you some outstanding insight into the current state of play in critical elections, both in Washington and in our states. Our first two speakers will be Ryan Bernstein from our Washington, D.C. office and Mona Mahib, also from our Washington, D.C. office. Ryan, Mona, will you lead off a discussion of our U.S. Senate races for the group?
Governor, thank you. Happy to do so, and good morning to everybody. Really enjoy talking about, frankly, the Senate races. I mean, the Senate typically is one of the most boring chambers, probably the most boring chamber to watch during legislative proceedings, but probably the most exciting elections. They give us one of the most exciting elections almost every year. At least it was last go around, and probably will be this cycle and next cycle. As everybody knows, the Senate is split 50-50, and midterms are typically pretty rough for the party that controls the White House. The last three elections in the Senate, the party in control of the White House has lost seats. And frankly, over the last 100 years, the party in power in the White House has lost seats 18 times and only gaining seats 5 times. So you can see that this is not a recent trend. This is a trend that has been going on for the last 100 years, and it's largely the mood of the country. But some of that has shifted over the last cycle or two with really, frankly, personalities playing more of a prominent role and, frankly, stronger party affiliation. And there's been less ticket splitting recently than there has in the past. And I think that's going to play into some of the conversation that we have today between the federal side and a lot of the state conversations that my colleagues are going to have also. So coming into the 2022 midterms, the general perception was the Republicans in the Senate had the easier hill to climb. And that's largely for the reasons we just talked about. But I would say the numbers themselves don't necessarily bear that out. There are 35 seats up, 21 are held by Republicans, and only 14 by Democrats. So the Republicans have a lot of seats that they're trying to hold, and then they have to pick up. Now, that's very different than what we'll see in 2024. There will be 23 Democrats up in 2024 if you include King and Sanders, and only 10 Republicans up at that point. And all 10 are in really pretty red states. And the only one there at this point that looks like they could have some issues is Ted Cruz in Texas in 2024. So outside of that, really, this election is setting up in the Senate as maybe who will control the Senate. If the Republicans can get control of it now, they may control it for the next 4 years. At least the probability will be on their side to do so. So this election is hugely consequential for the Republicans and for the Senate moving forward. One of the reasons I also think that, coming into this, Republicans still have a little hill to climb is it's 50-50, and the Republicans have to hold Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio just to keep the 50 plus then and hold the rest plus add one more. And this has gone kind of with ebbs and flows. All my Republican colleagues and if this election was held in August, it wasn't a good month for Republicans, but things are kind of coming back now. What we're seeing in Wisconsin is really Senator Johnson actually doing fairly well and polling fairly well. He's even in the polls 2 to 3 points ahead of Barnes, which honestly is somewhat surprising just because of the nature of the polls usually in Wisconsin. Last time, Senator Johnson was never up in any of the polls. So the fact that he's up this time does poll and bode pretty well for Senator Johnson. And the polls in Wisconsin have historically been even difficult to predict the winner in the presidential election. Biden was up 10 points in the last polls, but ended up winning the state by less than 1%. So As Senator Johnson, as Republicans feel, he has a pretty good shot here and is feeling not safe, but pretty confident that that's going to work out for the Republicans. Now, the other couple states are going to be tough. I'm going to start with Ohio. You know, Ohio has shifted quite a bit to being more of a red state. J.D. Vance obviously has quite a personality. People know of him. And Tim Ryan is a good sitting congressional Democrat. So it's a tough race with two very different paths for each candidate to come to this place. But with Ohio being fairly red, JD is right now up 2 to 4 points. So I think this state will actually kind of depend on, for the Democrats, whether or not the Democrats are going to be able to split that ticket. As my colleagues will talk about later, the Ohio governor race looks pretty good for the Republicans. So the Democrats are going to need ticket splitting here. And now that might be the opposite for what's going to maybe happen in Pennsylvania. The Republicans may need to count on ticket splitting in Pennsylvania with Fetterman and Mehmet Oz running. Of course, a lot of you probably saw the debate or heard about the debate last night. We'll see how that plays out. But right now, Fetterman has a 1 to probably a 3 point lead, but that's been shifting quite a bit. Probably in one of the states, almost as fast shifting towards the Republicans as any other state that we've seen as far as the momentum building on the Republican side. So that will be a very, very close race. So look, we have to, as Republicans, hold those three likely if we're going to have a chance of taking over the Senate, plus pick up one more. So if we lose Pennsylvania, which right now we're below on the polls, it makes it that much more difficult. So the math is a little difficult for the Republicans at this point. But what states will the Republicans likely pick up? I think everybody on the Republican side, talking with party leaders here, look, we're all focused really, frankly, on Nevada. Georgia gets a lot of the play, but Nevada is likely the place here that the Republicans feel the best about it. Senator Cortez Masto is underwater, under 50% approval rating. Things have been trending pretty good for Adam Lexall. He's an Iraq veteran, former AG of Nevada, has run statewide before. He's really got the political pedigree. He's the son of a former senator and the grandson of the former governor of Nevada. So he's well known. They feel pretty confident about that race. And right now, the polls have him up over about a point above Cortez Masto. So as things continue to progress, I'd say the Republicans say, look, if we can keep those three, Nevada, look at Nevada. We have a very good chance of picking that one up. A lot of press, of course, in Georgia. There's been a record turnout now in pre-election voting, early voting. That could break either way. Look, Democrats generally, of course, do better on the pre-election early voting. So I wouldn't read too much into that at this point, other than people are motivated. This is the other tough part. In Georgia, as we know from last go around, you need to get 50% plus to win this election. You need 50%. And there is a third party candidate, a libertarian in this race that's polling at about 3%. And right now, neither Warnock or Walker has in the polls more than 50%. So this could run to a general runoff, which would take place December 6th. So here we go again. If Republicans do hold all the three, but don't pick up Nevada or lose Pennsylvania, all eyes could be on Georgia one more time. As far as what the Republicans are also looking at, look, we feel not as optimistic of Colorado and New Hampshire as maybe some of the larger media general narrative has been out there. Things have been moving in the right directions for the Republicans in Colorado in particular, but it's still a very steep hill for the Republicans to climb there. Bennett's probably still up 6-7 points in Colorado. Arizona, it's going to be an interesting race with the governor on the ballot. Senator Kelly, I think, is still fairly favored in Arizona to retain that for the Democrats. But that's another state that if something were to have a wave, I think that you'd see Nevada, Georgia, and then Arizona go in that order. The only other thing that I'll kind of bring up that the Republicans have to be very careful of. And I always like to pick out kind of a sleeper state that some people are talking about, and it's kind of, closer than I think a lot of people would have guessed probably going into this on the Republican side, is North Carolina. Even though it was a very expensive race for Tillis last go around, Ted Budd is a sitting U.S. congressman, run a good race, but so has Sherry Beasley. That is something that internally the Republicans are telling everybody, we got to watch North Carolina. We can't take that one for granted. This is a very tough race that could go either way. Now, there's also some very happy talk, I would say, about Washington State with Patty Murray. There's a great candidate running there, and Tiffany Smiley, but you would need to see a major red wave for Washington to move. So there's been some money following Tiffany Smiley, mostly because she's a good candidate and they would like to have a good showing in Washington. But I think people on the Republican side are generally worried, if we're worried at all, about losing a surprise one, would be North Carolina. So with over 6 million votes already cast, there's a lot of interest in the Senate races, of course. And with the economy trending the way it is, some of the narrative, Republicans are feeling pretty good. But I know my colleague Mona probably can give you the other side of that coin on the Democratic side, and where they see that they may have a surprise win or two, and what they feel like that is their strongholds, so that they can keep the Senate. So with that, Mona, what's your perspective on the Senate moving into the midterm elections?
Sure. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Ryan, obviously, as always, did an excellent job. I really appreciate these sort of measured expectations that Ryan's putting out for the Republicans. Obviously, there's a lot of folks in town who feel very bullish on the Republicans taking over. I mean, and also because given the sort of historical pressure that's on the Republicans to maintain the order of with President Biden being in office, that, obviously the expectation is that the Republicans will do well. So Ryan, I think, has done a nice job of sort of modifying expectations, although, history is, a lot of pressure from history. Look, it's, I also wish this was a month or so ago. Gas prices were going down. It felt like, the Democrats had a little bit of momentum, and, honestly, about a month or so, I was saying we're going to keep it all. So I still would like to say remain bullish, but I also recognize that we've got some real tough situations. Ryan did a great job of laying out sort of the races as they are. It's 50-50. I mean, there is no slack. Obviously, the vice president keeps her Converse laced up. We need her regularly, and we hope to continue to have her running down here to be our tiebreaker vote. For us, obviously we've got to hold everything we have. And the two races, as Ryan delineated, are Nevada and Georgia. And, we've got Scott and Clayton, who are our resident Georgia experts here in DC. So I know we'll talk a little bit as it connects to the governor's races as well. Nevada is tough. I mean, it is the race right now that I think is the toughest that we're paying a lot of attention to, in great part because what is absent now is the Reid machine. Majority Leader Harry Reid had an incredible machine in Nevada, and Democrats over the last couple of cycles were really benefited by having that. And with his passing, there's been some changes in the Democratic Party there. And so I think Governor Sisolak and Senator Cortez Masto have really had to kind of work together to sort of create their own network. So I think there's some structural challenges with that race. Also a question of, she is a Hispanic senator, but there is a question of where there's no monolithic Hispanic community in Nevada, of course, but where are they, and will they move to the Republican side of the ticket, which is a perennial issue that I think will continue to be something Democrats watch, national Democrats watch in the state. It is the one I think, that we are watching the most. I'm hopeful, but it is honestly a very difficult race for us. If we don't hold Georgia and we don't hold Nevada, it's going to be a real challenge, because then we're going to have to pick up one of the states. And the states I think that we think about are, Ohio, which could be a challenge. I think some Democrats think of Ohio as sort of Lucy in the football for us pretty perpetually. We come up with very good candidates, and somehow the structure of Ohio makes it challenging. But Congressman Ryan is a great candidate. I think he's run this race right. He's raising money. He's got a good ground game, but we will absolutely be the beneficiary of split tickets, Ryan. I love Mayor Whaley. She is a fantastic Democratic candidate. I know we'll talk about the governors later in the conversation, but Governor DeWine seems to be in very good shape. And so he'll have some coattails for the Senate race. But this is specifically a state where Democrats are very hopeful on split ticketing so that Tim Ryan can do it. It's very close. And there's obviously a lot of money on both sides, but particularly the national Republicans that are going into the Senate race, which may be able to pull Mr. Vance over the line. But we remain optimistic on that. North Carolina is a great, we always, as Ryan said, try to pick one race to spotlight. We have a fantastic candidate in Sherry Beasley, who's won statewide before. She's won with a lot of bipartisan support. And she's outraising Congressman Budd. So it's going to come down to a great field operation, which, obviously Democrats do quite well on. So optimistic right now. She's a little bit down, but I think she also may be the beneficiary of some increased registration numbers in a post-Dobbs world, which we'll talk about in a second. So, we've got to keep all our seats and we've got to pick up a couple of seats. I think we'll keep Arizona. I think we're fine in New Hampshire. That was, as Ryan said, a race a little bit people were worried about. But once the Republicans had their primary, I think Democrats felt like they were in much better position. And, obviously we remain hopeful in Wisconsin, but Pennsylvania obviously is going to get a lot of the oxygen over the next couple of days. And I do think one of the things that's interesting is this past Monday, 500,000 people have already voted in Pennsylvania. Now, Ryan will sort of poo-poo it a little bit by saying, well, Democrats always do a good job of voting early, but what it comes down to is what happens on election day, where maybe Republicans can make up the gap. But I think Democrats will be encouraged with that early vote by the wide margins among all the early votes, particularly with first-time voters, which I think bode well for Democrats and, sort of women driving it. So the other piece I'll mention is Ryan mentioned some of the global factors. Of course, I think a lot of these Senate races are getting nationalized and, it's hard, right? It's very easy to talk about inflation, crime, a lot of issues to sort of tie every Democratic candidate or incumbent to the president, particularly with his not as high poll numbers as I think we would like. So yeah, those are sort of inherent challenges, but I think we have very strong candidates across the board. So I think we feel good, who are working hard, who are getting the money they need, who are building great field operations. One of the things I think sort of the elephant in the room that we shouldn't ignore is sort of a post-Dobbs world. A number of people have said to me, oh, it's too bad that decision came out as early as it did, which is a really cynical way to look at it. But I think what we've got to pay attention to is the numbers. What do registration numbers look like? What do registration numbers amongst women, people under 30? I think that will be a big tell for us on election day, is maybe there's sort of a quiet group of folks who in a post-Dobbs world are concerned about future direction if the Republicans have majorities in the House and the Senate. So I'm curious to see how that vote will impact. But so I would like to be super optimistic, but that's not my nature. So I'm nervous, but we've got great candidates and we're hopeful that we can pick up one of these seats.
Thanks to you both. It really is interesting, this discussion around the extent to which these elections are nationalized. Historically, there were lots of local factors with candidates, but it does, I think, Ryan, you initially mentioned it, the whole point of how elections have become nationalized, both in fundraising and in the approach voters take toward candidates. We can talk about that a bit more later. I was remiss in mentioning the credentials of our last two presenters as well. Ryan was chief of staff to Senator Hoeven on the Hill. Before that, worked in the governor's office in North Dakota. Mona was policy director at the DGA before she joined us. Mona, probably about 14 years ago, and also worked in the Clinton White House and at the Department of Labor. So these two have certainly understand DC elections very well and have great insight. So thanks to you both. And now I'm going to move to our two Georgia Bulldogs here, Clayton Cox, who is on the Democratic side, and Scott Binkley on the Republican side. Clayton worked at the DNC. He was treasurer of the DNC, or finance director, I'm sorry, at the DNC, and certainly knows and understands these issues, was very involved in the Biden election during the last cycle in particular. Scott Binkley headed the Republican Lieutenant Governors Association prior to joining us, and also was the campaign manager of a statewide gubernatorial campaign. Both Scott and Clayton know issues involving the U.S. House of Representatives quite well. I believe, Clayton, you're going to lead on this, and then Scott is going to follow to give us a few minutes about House races. So, Clayton, I'm sorry, Scott, you're going first on this. So, Scott, you lead off.
We remain nimble, so that's fine. No, thank you, Governor, and Mona and Ryan. That was a good overview of the Senate side, and obviously that conversation dovetails into, as we have a discussion about the U.S. House. McGuire Woods Consulting, we've been preparing for Republicans to take back the House for a couple of years now, and here's a little bit of background on why we've been doing so. Currently, Democrats hold an 8-seat majority in the House. As a reminder, 218 seats make a majority. And Republicans are bullish, particularly because of the good environment behind them. Here's a couple of numbers to get a feel for that environment. Biden's approval rating, I'm surprised I'm the first to raise it, is down this week even further from 44 to 43. So that it remains, a positive for Republicans, obviously a drag for Democrats running for House seats. The generic congressional ballot, again, in Republicans' favor this week. NBC News had a poll out that was Republicans +1 in that generic congressional ballot. This morning, the Dems were up 5 in Politico Morning Consult's poll. But one thing to remember as you look at these are polls of registered voters. If you look at samples of likely voters, the numbers seem to swing in Republicans' favor, or are more advantageous for Republicans when polling likely voters. All of that to say, the environment is certainly in the Republicans' favor. 538, which is a prognosticator online that's pretty reputable, projects the likelihood of Republicans to take the House at 81%. And so as you look at that, here's how Republicans will build their majority. Right now, there's a total of 218 seats that are rated safe, likely, or lean Republicans. So that's your majority there. I think the next question will be, how do you build from there, and how significant of a majority can the Republicans build? There are about 20 to 25 toss-up seats. So again, Republicans' majority will be determined on how many of those toss-up races they could win. And then another big question going forward will be how tight of a majority there will be, and what challenges that will present Speaker McCarthy, the rest of his leadership team, as well as committee chairmanships. And interestingly enough, we're going to be hosting another webinar after the election, and we'll dive more into that. So that's a little bit of the background on the environment for Republicans running for House. It is likely that the Republicans will take back the House, and it'll be interesting to see how large their majority is and who lands those committee chairmanships and the rest of the leadership positions. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Clayton Cox to give his perspective from the Democratic side.
Thank you, Scott, and good to be with all of you. As Scott said, I think people reading the political tea leaves would tell you that this is a difficult environment for Democrats, and I think folks are pretty eyes wide open about that. I mean, Mona and Ryan hit this on the head, but structurally, if you look at the history of sort of where midterms election goes, it's very difficult for the incumbent party, especially when the president's party holds the House and the Senate. It's very difficult. If you look at the last 30 midterms, so over the last 100 years, the president's party has lost seats in the House in 26 of them, and only once since 1946, only once has the president's party in the House gained seats, and that was the 2002 midterms with President Bush. And that is certainly the anomaly. So I think overall, voters are sort of in the mindset of trying to keep control and trying to keep some sort of equilibrium. And so, it swings one way, it goes back the other. If you think back to, Obama's 2010, when he called the midterm a shellacking, W. Bush calling the midterm in 06 a thumping. It is certainly a difficult environment for the president's party to maintain their House majority and to make sure that they gain seats. So I think just eyes wide open about it. I'm going to walk real quick through the numbers and some other, I think, structural things that make it difficult for Democrats. And I'll talk about what's good, where Democrats have hope and where we think there could actually be some rays of sunshine and why we think this is not as bad as it's or not going to be as much of a normal sort of midterm election as we've typically seen. And then finally, I'll sort of throw in what you should watch election night. If you write anything down, I'd write down that piece at the end of where to look as you're watching election night returns to sort of see what kind of night we're in for. So I think numbers wise, Scott said all of it, but the generic ballot, at least for the last year, has had Republicans in the lead. You've seen the president's numbers and the Democrats' generic numbers. That's when they go ask people, the very specific question of who would you rather have, a generic Republican, generic Democrat. That has been in favor of Republicans since about right after the Afghanistan withdrawal in summer of 2021. So you've seen from last August until the Dobbs decision, a pretty significant Republican lead on the generic ballot. Post Dobbs and sort of the Democratic resurgence, I would say, coupled with the wins on the Inflation Reduction Act being passed and some other sort of base priorities, you've actually seen a lot of Democrats come home and that sort of enthusiasm increase. You had a period for about 3 months or so where Democrats actually had a slight lead in the House generic ballot polling. So very hard to read. You've had some back and forth, but now as of last week, Republicans are now taking the lead in the House generic polling. I think one thing Ryan mentioned this earlier, one thing we really value in politics as a longtime political hack is the trending and where things are going, where the momentum is. And it's certainly trending, I would say, in the Republicans' favor. If you look at the sort of the line graph over time, Republicans are now starting to pick back up. You've had a lot of generic polling coming out showing the Republicans with those leads. As of yesterday, Cook Political Reports, which is sort of the Bible of political prognosticators, upped their House Republican flip number from 10 to 15 to 12 to 15 seats. So I think it's certainly within the realm that, things are, it's an uphill battle for Speaker Pelosi and her leadership team. I think another thing that structurally we should look at, besides the sort of normal midterm election, why it's tough for the incumbent party, is the amount of retirements on the Democratic side. You've actually had 22 Democrats in the House retire. That is over twice the number of Republicans that are retired. So you've got a lot of Democrats that hold sort of very specific seats and that are candidates sort of curtailed for those districts that a new sort of Democratic face is going to have a difficult time. People who are a brand within their community that sort of bucks the normal national trend. And as Governor Hodges said, the nationalization of races has made it a lot harder for sort of new candidates to come in these places. One thing I would think about is in political science, they always say there's what do you think of Congress, which is always bad. And then what do you think of your member of Congress? And that's always pretty good. So with those retirements, Democrats are certainly ceding a good number of seats. Another area, Scott mentioned it, the president's approval rating. It has ticked up. It's gotten a little bit better over the last few months, but it is still a challenge. You're hitting at around 53 to 44 of a sort of average of disapproval rating. That's not as historically bad as some presidents have had going into their first midterm, but it's certainly not good, and I think a challenge. One other area that's like a structural difficulty and challenge for Democrats to overcome is redistricting. Republicans did a great job of making the map favorable to themselves in 2010. In a lot of red states, it was kind of harder to make it any more favorable to Republicans than it already was. So Democrats kind of spent the last decade saying, we've got to do something about this. In a lot of states that they controlled power, they sort of ceded redistricting over to nonpartisan commissions or to judges and others to look at it. So in places where Democrats could run up the score and make really favorable maps, New York, New Jersey, they've instead ceded that over to nonpartisan commissions. So, for example, in New York, they originally put a map together that gave Democrats a huge, like a 24-5 advantage. That has now come back down. And so you're actually seeing a lot of very difficult races for Democrats in a blue state like New York. Illinois is sort of the only aberration to that. Final piece I'll touch on, good news, why there's a chance, why we think, Scott said that 19% is possible of making sure Democrats control the House and keep the majority. The Dobbs decision, energy, Mona mentioned it, it cannot be understated. There's been a slew of special elections in the House, Alaska, upstate New York, places where Republicans have a pretty significant lead, where Donald Trump performed very well in the 2020 election. Democrats actually won. You're also seeing places, rural Minnesota, Nebraska, major Republican favored and leaning districts where Democrats are overperforming by 5 to 10 points. Fundraising is been very advantageous. Democrats have outraised their opponents in 50 of the 65 most competitive districts. So they're applying that incumbency advantage well. The Dobbs energy, like I said, I think that cannot be understated. That is, you're seeing a lot of new registrants, a lot of first-time voters, people coming out of the woodworks. I think on the Democratic side, you're sort of hearing maybe this is our moment to get those infrequent voters out, the way that President Trump did for Republicans or President Obama did for Democrats. A lot of times midterms for Democrats are a fall-off election. They are where the base sort of fails to vote, fails to turn out, and fails to be energized. But I think the Biden administration has done a great job of giving red meat for the base as far as the Inflation Reduction Act, other pieces of legislation, and movement on medical marijuana criminalization reform and student loan debt relief. Those are things that the Democratic base cares a lot about. There's a good deal of things that the Democratic base should feel very excited and happy about. So I think you're going to see in that softness of some of the president's support with Democrats, that a lot of those people will come home, and that's going to help his numbers and help Democrats across the country. Final piece I think to feel positive about, it's a large map. Democrats are not sort of buttonholed into one or two states or one or two regions where they can win or pick up seats. I think they are seeing that they can kind of play on offense and be competitive everywhere. So that obviously, that makes for a interesting night on the 8th, and we will see what happens. I would, if I'm any of you, make sure to, I think, write down these 3 races that I would look for on election night. The Rhode Island 2nd, that's where Republicans have not held a congressional seat since 1992. You've got a very strong candidate in Republican Mayor of Cranston, Alan Fung. He's run statewide several times. If he flips that seat in the 2nd congressional district to Republicans, an open race, I think that will sort of forebode where we're going for the evening. That's one of the earlier poll closing times. In Georgia, you've got the 2nd congressional district with Sanford Bishop holding what I would call an ancestral Democratic seat down in Southwest Georgia. So if that flips to Republicans, I think that might be some evidence of the rural urban divide worsening and even the education divide worsening. And someone like Sanford Bishop, who's got a great brand and ability to win in a place like Southwest Georgia, not being able to overcome the sort of structural challenges. And then the final place I would look, North Carolina, you're going to have 2 seats in the suburbs, the 13th and 14th congressional district, that are open seats that sort of will show us are the trends of 2018 and 2020 continuing, where a lot of our partisan fault lines are along education and income bracket levels. So are the suburbs trending towards Democrats still, or are they going back home to Republicans? So we'll see in those 2 races how they come out. With that, I will pass it back to Governor Hodges to give us into the world of governors and AG's races.
Thank you both to Scott and Clayton. Very valuable information about House races and good insight. Let me just say to several of you who have sent questions in, we're going to hold the questions until the end. We have a series that have come in, probably 5 or 6, and thought we would hold it for our panelists till the very end to cover, because we do want to move into state races. Just a very brief statement about our practice at McGuire Woods Consulting. As you can see here, we cover both Washington, D.C. and the states. Our view has always been that we want to be able to help our clients, whether they have issues in the state capitals, large cities, or in Washington. And we're a bit unique in that regard. There are many practices that are DC focused. There are others that are focused on specific state capitals. We do both. And in addition to that, we have what we call our 50-state practice, our national multi-state strategies, where we work with clients that have issues before the governors associations, the attorneys general, assurance commissioners, banking commissioners, the whole gamut of important state officials, with the two most important being the governors and the attorneys general, who are obviously in most states elected officials. We have a terrific panel to discuss our state races of critical importance here. It will be, in addition to, I believe, Mona, Scott, and Clayton, three that you've heard from, the other person joining us will be Mike Reynolds, who is in our Richmond office, but is a former senior official of a Republican gubernatorial administration of the state of Virginia. And Mike does an extensive amount of work with governors and with attorneys general around the country for our clients. And I believe we're going to start in this discussion of state races with Mike Reynolds. And Mike, you're going to talk about 4 state races, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And Governor, you hit the nail on the head. What we notice is our clients always have issues that persist regardless of who's in power. And so having a strong team that can navigate the halls of power, either in the state houses or in Washington, no matter who's in charge, is really critical. And right now, what we're seeing is a very divided America. It's 50-50. So who knows? Who knows how these races are all going to come out? With the governor's races, what we're seeing is there are currently 28 Republicans who hold office across the 50 states and 22 Democrats. Right now, there are 36 governor's races that will be on the ballot in 2 weeks, 20 Republicans and 16 Democrats. And then on the attorney general side, you have 30 races, so 6 fewer seats on the AG side. And there's currently 27 Republicans who hold the AG's position and 23 Democrats. And you might think, okay, I understand why a governor is so important, but why should I care about who is the attorney general? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, that position is typically referred to as the chief law enforcement officer or the head law enforcement officer. It's more than that. They do handle some criminal work and they talk a lot about immigration, working with law enforcement, but they're more the chief legal officer of the state. So they handle everything from landlord rent and housing, landlord tenant issues, consumer fraud protections. And then typically the party out of power in the White House, those attorneys general will go and sue the administration and get headlines that way. Also, just so you know, a number of former attorneys general have gone on to bigger and better things, including Vice President Harris, the HHS Secretary Becerra, the Energy Secretary Granholm, a number of governors, Governor Cooper in North Carolina, Governor McMaster in South Carolina, Governor Abbott of Texas, and then a number of United States senators and other folks. Other former attorneys general include Walter Mondale, Bill Clinton, John Ashcroft, Andrew Cuomo, and everyone's least favorite politician, Eliot Spitzer. So these attorneys general will, many of them will rise to other offices down the road. So looking at a couple of hot button congressional races, one of the biggest ones is, governor's races. The biggest one is in Arizona. And there you have Governor Ducey, who is term limited out. And so Carrie Lake is the Republican nominee versus Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. Lake is a Fox News 5 former anchor. She's focused on borders, immigration, energy, crime, and education. Governor Ducey endorsed Lake's opponent during the primary, and he is one of the co-chairs of the Republican Governors Association. And about a month after she received the nomination, he did come out and say that the group is running ads in support of her. Ms. Hobbs is a former social worker and again is a Secretary of State. With the Senate race on top, you're seeing a lot of money spent in Arizona. In the governor's race alone, there's more than $30 million that's being spent on TV. So it's just a tremendous amount of attention being put on that race. There's also an attorney general's race in that state, which pits Abe Hamadeh. He's a 31-year-old attorney from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, who is a former U.S. Army and Army Reserve officer. He actually did an overseas deployment in Saudi Arabia and has been focused a lot on immigration and fentanyl. And then he is facing off against Democrat Chris Mays. Ms. Mays is the former corporation commissioner for the state of Arizona, and she was actually a Republican until she switched parties in 2019. That race is seen as a dead even race. It was held by a Republican incumbent who is term limited as well. So then looking at another race, another state that's a hot button state, that's Nevada. And as you heard about the Senate race there, you've got a lot of attention from the federal side, but then also on the state side too, with Governor Sisolak, who is the incumbent. He has a $6.5 million cash on hand to $4 million over his Republican opponent, Joe Lombardo. And he has outspent Mr. Lombardo, the Republican, 7-1 of late. There's a lot of outside influence and outside groups paying attention to this race. Sisolak had a 4-point win 4 years ago, and he did raise taxes. This time he's come in and said, we're not going to raise taxes, and he agreed with Lombardo. Lombardo is an Army veteran and former head of the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. And he actually served on Governor Sisolak's transition team. He was the sole Republican on that transition team. And those two gentlemen actually worked together in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting back in October of 2017. They were partners. Governor Sisolak was then the chair of the Clark County Commission, and obviously Lombardo was right there with the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. It's a very intense race, and there's a lot of mud being slung back and forth. Governor Sisolak has faced some criticism over his handling of education, and in fact, the largest education union in Nevada has declined to endorse in that race. But they've got the culinary unions who've knocked on, I believe, about 650,000 doors to combat that. So that's a very heated race. You also then down ticket have an attorney general's race where the attorney general incumbent, Aaron Ford, he's a Democrat, is running against Sigal Chattah. And Ms. Chattah is a civil and criminal attorney. She's been pressed pretty regularly on her views on the 2020 election and those controversies there. She currently holds a 2-point lead with only 39 to 37%. So there's still a lot of undecided folks in that race. Mr. Ford was facing some accusations of some misdeeds that he committed back when he was in college, and for some reason this is apparently fair game again that people are making hay out of during this race. So we'll see what happens on that front. Then moving over to another state, this is sort of Midwest nice, moving from Nevada over to what's going on in Kansas. And you have the current governor, Laura Kelly, who's the incumbent. She's a Democrat from Topeka, and she's faced off against the Attorney General Derek Schmidt from Lawrence, Kansas. And Mr. Schmidt has been the Attorney General there for more than a decade. Ms. Kelly is focusing on early childhood education. She talks a lot about her bipartisanship and how she worked with folks across the aisle. And remember, in Kansas, the legislature is about 2/3 Republican, so she really has to do that. She talks a lot about her economic development. She talks about her disagreements with the Biden administration over some of their COVID mandates. And Mr. Schmidt, on the other side, is targeting her, talking about how trying to nationalize the race and really push some of the comments about her ties to Joe Biden. That is seen as a toss-up race, and it's a question, as one analysis of the race was, is there still any politics left that's local? Is this a local race, or will this be nationalized? Because obviously Kansas is seen as a fairly Republican state on the national political scene. And then finally, I'll talk about Governor Evers in Wisconsin. He is the incumbent there. As Ryan said, the polls in Wisconsin are very, very difficult to read. They tend to be off. It's a very evenly divided electorate. Mr. Evers has been accused by his Republican opponent, Tim Mitchells, of being soft on crime. The Republican there, Mr. Mitchells, he owns a family construction company. He's also a past candidate. He ran in 2004, the United States Senate. Very different time than we're facing now. And so that race is neck and neck again. It's 50-50 country, 50-50 state. We'll see who shows up and also what sort of pressures are put on there from folks who would vote in the Senate race and then on governor. So with that, I'll turn it back over to my colleagues.
Sure. Well, I'll just do a quick overview from the Democratic side. Mike, thank you for laying that out. I'll start on the Democratic side. On the governor's, two races we feel very good about are Massachusetts and Maryland. Those are great opportunities for the Democrats to put those two states that are traditionally blue states back into their column. I think we've seen over the years with the Republican governors there, they've been moderate in their stance to have to be reflective of their states. But in Maryland, we have Wes Moore, who is a outstanding former Army officer, former CEO of the nonprofit Robin Hood Foundation in New York. Just saw his commercial with President Obama this morning. So he's running a very strong race in Maryland. We have Maura Healey, who is a well-known attorney general, running for governor of Massachusetts. So that's two very exciting states that will, I think, be put back in the Democratic column. So feel good about that. Mike did a good job of sort of outlaying the sort of toss-up states, Kansas, Nevada, Wisconsin. Mike talked about, Kansas in particular. I think Laura Kelly is absolutely the right. She's done a great job. I think with all of the governors, particularly on the Democratic side, there's been a lot of attention. So even though we're still living it, people are forgetting, they were on the front lines during pandemic and their pandemic response. And I think she's getting a lot of kudos, as a number of governors are across the country, for their role. So I think she'll be buoyed by that. Also, I think she's done a good job of denationalizing, if you can, sort of her role as governor, and because she has a long, authentic history of being bipartisan and working across Republican lines. Nevada, obviously, Mike said, is a tough race. Wisconsin, I think people are concerned, in the sort of national press, but I think he's doing well on the ground, and I think there's a great ground effort going on that'll help the candidates. The other race, just notable, is because we don't usually talk about Oregon, but we have an interesting race going on in Oregon. It's a three-way race. We have Tina Kotek, who's a Speaker of the House, a Democrat, Chris Drazen, Republican, and there's an independent candidate, Betsy Johnson, who used to be a Democrat. And this is another example of where this third party might be the kiss of death, but can't believe we're talking about Oregon, but it's a funny world. So that's certainly a race to watch out for. If I remember correctly, Pennsylvania is a great opportunity for us to hold a very important state with Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General, running a really strong race. And that's a case where he's up by 9 and 10 points over Mr. Mastriano. So whether it's split ticket or maybe we could look at a race like that to maybe have some coattails, that could be very helpful to Fetterman in the Senate race. So we'll see. One race I really would like to spend a minute on is Georgia. We'd be remiss having Scott and Clayton because it is so connected to what's happening at the federal level. That's a perfect example for us of how sort of our federal and our national practice are really intertwined. If you guys want to take a minute to talk about that governor's race.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Mona. As Mona mentioned, it's both Clayton and my home state. Georgia has become front and center in all things politics in the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years, and will continue to be so into the future. And I think that's why it's wonderful to have Clayton as part of the team, because more than ever, Georgia requires a bipartisan approach. I think a couple things to note on Governor Kemp's race. He's obviously run a very good race. He's had a great first 3 years in office. I think one thing to think about will be after a surprisingly, trouncing of his a surprising trouncing of his primary challenger backed by Trump, as well as probably what will be a 5 or 7 point win over Stacey Abrams, who has become a darling of the left and Democrats. I think we'll see Governor Kemp take a mantle as a national figure in the Republican Party, and whatever that means, we'll see. But I think that a lot of people are starting to talk about that. Another thing to note on Georgia, and I think Clayton will touch on this a little bit more, would be record turnout in the first couple of weeks of early voting. And so beyond presidential levels of early voting turnout. And then another thing to mention, Ryan and Mona talked about the Senate race in Georgia. I spoke with some folks with Governor Kemp's team this morning down there, and following the debate last week, and then with a couple weeks now since some allegations against Herschel Walker, that his numbers have stabilized. And I think that's also helping Governor Kemp. And it'll be interesting to see. We've talked about the ticket splitters, and we've talked about governor's races pulling up, struggling Senate races and vice versa. It seems to me that the number would have to be Kemp winning by over 7 in order to have the coattails needed to really pull Herschel Walker, unless Herschel Walker can do something to get a little wind behind his sails himself. So that's my thought on Georgia. Clayton?
Thanks, Scott. The other thing I would add is I would watch, like we've I think said it repeatedly, I think Georgia is going to have a big ticket splitting contingency of people, especially in the suburbs, who might be voting for Governor Kemp and then for Senator Warnock. So we'll really have to watch those things. I think it'll be very interesting because it'll show, the sort of how the political fault lines go in the future here, with folks who are sort of middle to high income, high education, that typically voted Republican, now voting Democrat, but seeming to be in a very good spot with Governor Kemp. And Governor Kemp had a huge rally last week in Alpharetta, which was sort of like the battleground of Georgia for 2020 and prior to that. The early vote numbers, as Scott mentioned, do look very good. It's very hard to say who's voting for who and how it all breaks down. You've got turnout early vote wise that's almost double 2018 and is on pace to surpass a 2020 presidential turnout level in Georgia, which is really astounding. Early vote numbers, we do know some demographic data on them. Very strong turnout among African-American voters, strong turnout among women voters, and then voters over 50. So you've kind of got a little bit to like for each side of the aisle. The other thing I think to note for Georgia, for Democrats, is I think the Republicans too, with Governor Kemp, I think both sides have adjusted to the new reality very well. The Democratic statewide ticket looks sort of like what I think the Democratic Party's ideal sort of coalition is for the future. You've got Stacey Abrams, an African-American woman running for governor, Charlie Bailey, a good friend and prosecutor from South Georgia, running for lieutenant governor, Bee Nguyen, a daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, running for Secretary of State from Gwinnett County. So you've really got this coalition that Georgia's, I think, adjusting to well. But not to be taken for granted, Governor Kemp is going to all of these places. I mean, he is, say what you will, Democrat, Republican, or what you think of his job, he is an incredible campaigner and is taking no area for granted. He has done, I think, a pretty good job of peeling off at the margins African-American men and some other diverse voting coalitions that might typically vote for Democrats. So he's kind of been all over the state. Stacey Abrams has been all over the state. It's really going to be an interesting election. And I think the turnout numbers so far show that people are energized and people are trying to figure out where to go. Final piece, the amount of money in Georgia is unbelievable. Senator Warnock just passed $100 million for the cycle for a Senate race in Georgia. As someone from Georgia who does Democratic fundraising, if we would have had a candidate, 6 years ago that could raise $5 million, we would have been thrilled. So it's really a different ball game. It's something to watch for the future. And I think Georgia will give us some really valuable national lessons on where we are as far as the partisan and educational fault lines on voting, and where we are sort of in the Trump, potentially post-President Trump or President Trump reality, depending on what candidates win. So I would really pay attention to the numbers afterwards on November 8th in Georgia.
Governor, we'll turn it back over to you. Just want to say this is a great example of sort of how our federal team and our folks who pay attention to races across the country, it's that great sort of composite sort of vantage that we try to provide for our friends.
Thanks, Mona, and thanks to the panelists. It really is fascinating to watch what it almost looks like a parliamentary system sometimes in the Senate with the nationalization of these races, where the money's coming from. It is, as was noted earlier, is a dramatic difference from 5-10 years ago in terms of the dollars and what was expected of the candidates that are on the ground. So we're going to open it up for questions. We have a number of questions, and we are cognizant of time. I think we told you it'd be about an hour. It's now about a little after 11:55. So we're going to do about 10 minutes worth of questions. And I'm going to ask the panelists to be as concise as they can to answering these questions. The first one we had is a question that I'm going to ask Ryan to start off with. And that is, do you see President Biden wandering back to the middle after the midterms? President Clinton was in the same situation and now is seen in history as a great president because he came back to the middle. Okay, in the spirit of bipartisanship, Ryan, why don't you cover that? And then I think maybe Clayton was on the Democratic side will cover it.
Yeah, and I'll probably give a little bit a different answer than maybe it would be expected. I think he could do that if the Republicans actually do well and do really well, because I think to move back to the middle and get any legislation passed, the Republicans got to have the Senate and they have to have a governing majority in the House. If the Senate stays Democrat and the House goes Republican, you're going to see infighting there where not much legislation will go back and forth. And on the House side, you have to have a pretty big win by the Republicans in order for things to move forward. Because talking to some members of the Freedom Caucus, there's probably about 10 to 15 of them that probably don't want any legislative wins for Biden. So you're going to have a pretty big night so you have a governing majority there. Even though Jim Jordan been promised the judiciary post from McCarthy, can he keep the rest of the caucus in line and the Freedom Caucus? It's going to be difficult. So in order to make it work, actually, I think you're going to have Republicans in both the Senate and the House so that something moves. Otherwise, there's going to be gridlock on the legislative side. And outside of that, I think I'd be looking toward a lot of executive actions from the president, because the low-hanging fruit has already been taken with infrastructure, with the veterans, and with China competitiveness. But Clayton may have a good insight on what Biden might be looking at, depending on how the elections play out.
It sounds right. I think the president, he was in the Senate for a very long time, 40 years. And I think his comfort level in being a sort of statesman and reaching across the aisle is pretty high. He's a consensus maker. He ran in the primary as someone who was, said we can't just burn it down on each side. We need to reach across the aisle. So I think he will have a level of comfort in sort of trying to create some sort of governing coalition and figuring things out. However, reality will, hit him in the face at some point with the sort of, what people say behind closed doors about working together, and then how our media and how our sort of social media systems work. So it'll be very interesting dynamic to watch. I'm sure staff will want sort of at the White House and at the DNC will want sort of those partisan fights to really draw comparisons, to draw lines in the sand, to show the different agendas. But at the same time, I do think the president, a lot of his inner circle are people who are comfortable. They don't want to just make Republicans the enemies. I think they do want to work together on things. That's where I think the president's sort of rhetoric on MAGA Republicans versus regular Republicans kind of comes into play. But again, just saying this is who I work with and this is who I won't work with is a lot harder to do in reality. Once, the sort of nationalization and the sort of bubbling up of partisanship gets a hold of it.
All right. So the next question that came from the audience was about bellwether bellwether races. So I'm going to put Mona and Mike Reynolds on the spot to offer up your insight into a bellwether race that you believe that everyone should be paying attention to.
Sure. Mike, I'll start if that's okay. Mine is a House race. And it's Kansas 2. And it's the former Congressman Jake LaTurner is the Republican incumbent. The Democratic challenger is Patrick Schmidt. a former Navy officer who's running an incredible race out there. And in a post-Kansas decision world, the numbers have been pretty phenomenal of registrations in his district. And I think kind of shortly after the Kansas decision, the numbers of people who were registered were as much as people who voted altogether 2 years ago. So this is a Navy officer who's a centrist, who's running an incredible race, a great ground race. And if we can win a race like Kansas 2-1, I think that's good for Governor Kelly and other folks on the Democratic side. But also maybe will show that there's hope, for the Democrats on the Republican side. So we didn't talk about the AG race in that. We'll save that for another time. But there's an interesting AG race going on in Kansas as well. Mike?
I think looking at 3 races in the Eastern time zone, House races again, the Rhode Island race that was mentioned earlier. And then I would look at 2 races in Virginia. There's the Virginia 2nd, which is currently held by Eileen Luria, a Navy veteran, got a real strong challenge from Jen Kiggins, a state senator, and Navy veteran as well. And then also in the 7th, Abigail Spanberger, a moderate Democrat who's just respected by both sides of the aisle as a very formidable politician. She was redistricted into a tougher seat. And you had Governor Glenn Youngkin and Ted Cruz campaigning for her challenger, Yesli Vega. Folks are seeming to think that Virginia 2 will go Republican and that the 7th is going to be a toss-up. Nobody knows which way is that going to go. So look at those early in the evening. Virginia polls close at 7, so you should have some clarity by 8:15 or so. And then you'll be able to see some of those other races down the line. I would be remiss if we didn't mention happy birthday to Scott Finkley. We know he's going to have hopefully he's going to have a good birthday present here in a couple of days. But yeah.
Well, Scott is getting married too, so he better say that that's the most important event of this year rather than the elections in 2022. That's a bit of advice, Scott, for somebody who's been married 35 years.
Fair enough. Thank you, Gov. Thanks, Mike.
So we are on time. And let me just say that we are happy to answer any other questions that you might have. It may be just, I do not see any more in the queue right now, but would just suggest if you have specific questions, please forward them to us and we will do our best to answer them. We also, if you want to call and have a discussion with any of our panelists about the elections coming up between now and the election, we would encourage you to do that because we're always available to have discussions. I might also add that post-election, we will have a similar overview of what happened, a post-mortem of the election. I think we also, to our Virginia friends, I believe we have Larry Sabato joining us again, as he normally does post-election, to provide some insight. As many of you know, Larry is one of the best prognosticators around and does an outstanding job of taking a look at trends that occurred in an election. Those are some of the things we have coming up and some of the opportunities you have to answer or to ask questions about things that are going on both in DC and around the country. If you want an invitation to the Sabato, to the conference where we talk about the election after the fact, and also to hear Larry Sabato, please email MJ Keats. She is MJ Keats, KEATTS at mwcllc.com. And you can find her on our website as well. MJ will make sure that you get an invitation to it and can participate in that. I've done this multiple times and just always find Larry's insight really helpful in terms of planning and looking at issues for the next year. With that, I think we are finished. And again, questions, please call us or please email us and we're happy to resolve that. And a special thanks to all of our panelists for the great job you did today.